We do not see the creation of the United States in the 18th century as a great leap forward for humanity. We see the creation of the United States of America as a great leap forward for enslavement of Africans, as a great leap forward in terms of European settlers seizing the land of the indigenous and then liquidating them. I'm afraid to say that many of our so-called friends on the left have either ignored our intervention, which is like biology teachers deciding that they don't like the uncovering of DNA in the early 1950s, and so therefore they're not going to teach that in their biology classes. And so this is scandalous. These books that I've been writing about slavery also invoke the notion of revolution. That is to say, my book confronting Black Jacobins, the United States Haitian Revolution, the origins of the Dominican Republic, confronts the epical, profound Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, a successful revolt of the enslaved. Many of us in the Black liberation movement in the United States pay careful and close attention to the international situation. And we use that in order to plot strategy. That helps to determine whether or not we should advance or should we retreat. And right now, I would say it's time for advance. I often say about the United States, if you want to keep it secret, publish it in a book, because people don't read. But I'm also beginning to think they don't necessarily listen either. So obviously there's something deeper. There's some sort of ideological blind spot that hampers the absorption of reality.
Good morning, or everyone. Welcome to Amandla, and welcome Dr. Horne. This is the first episode of Amandla, a monthly internationalist program with historian and political activist Dr. Gerald Horne. Before introducing our guest, I would like to welcome my co-host, Malika of the Pan African League Umoja, who is based in Monaco. Leonardo, who's not here with us yet, but will be here soon, who is also a member of the All African People Revolutionary Party, who will be joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa. My other co-host, Bouna of the Pan African League Umoja, joining us from Paris. And me, Natacha, who is joining you from Brooklyn, New York. So now let me turn to our guest, who will be our guest on every show. Dr. Gerald Horne. Our guest is a historian and longtime political activist, anti-racist, Pan-African, and working class struggles. He holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is the author of at least 50 books on a wide range of issues, including Black internationalism, the music and film industry, imperialism and class struggles, settler colonialism, white supremacy, and the resistance of enslaved Africans. His latest books include I Dare Say, and I don't have them up here, but I'll show them at the end. I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader, which will be discussed today. Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalist Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. African American in a new history, African Americans in a New History of the USA, which is available for pre-order. So this book is not yet out, but definitely go and pre-order the book. And he is also a trained lawyer. Gerald Horne has been at the forefront of the anti-apartheid struggle in the U.S. in the 1980s as the president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. Gerald Horne is also the co-producer and host of Freedom Now, a weekly Pan African internationalist and anti-imperialist program, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific, and can be found at kpfk.org or on the YouTube channel of the Activist News Network. He is also the permanent guest of three other important programs that are worth mentioning. So the Horne Report on diasporic music, which airs on Black Power 96 radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time and replays on the Activist News Network. The other one, Around the Horne, a weekly internationalist news update on the Activist News Network, and De Facto Podcast with our comrade Anthony Ballas. And now today's show, Amandla, right, on Black Power Media Reloaded. So, Dr. Horne, as always, it is an honor and a privilege to have you here with us. Thank you so much for launching your show with us here on Black Power Media Reloaded. We look forward to, an amazing show every time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And so we wanted to kind of start off a little bit by talking about the meaning of Amandla, but I think Bouna has a little bit to say about that.
Yeah, very quickly. The reason why we chose Amandla, for those among our audience who are wondering, and maybe most of them are aware of the meaning of Amandla, which is a word in Zulu and Xhosa, two languages that are widely spoken in South Africa, which means power. It has been a rallying cry in the days of resistance against apartheid. But it has also become a term that is associated with the struggle of the oppressed, right? And each episode of Amandla series with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's been at the forefront of the anti-apartheid struggle, as you mentioned, Natacha, and that is the reason why we chose Amandla as a title for this show. So each of the episodes will cover at least one of the books that Dr. Horne has written over the decades. And in this first episode, we'll be focusing on this book, I dare say, the Gerald Horne Reader, and we'll be discussing three main topics today. So first of all, the roots of African American opposition to US settler colonialism and imperialism. The second topic is the co-optation of sections of the African American community, the bourgeoisie, and the Lumpen to support US imperialism, a process that are referred to as the Faustian Bargain with the US rulers, or the Compromise of 1954. And the last topic that we'd like to talk about today is the reaction of so-called friends, so-called Americans have been facing. So the issue of white left-wing, what Dr. Horne has called left-wing white nationalism.
Thank you for that, Bouna. So we wanted to start off by just asking a first question. So in particular on the roots of African American opposition to U.S. settler colonialism and imperialism. Dr. Horne, in an article you published in 1996, which was titled "Who Lost the Cold War? Africans and African Americans," you argued that it may adhere in the nature of being an oppressed nationality to adopt viewpoints that are considered to be beyond the mainstream. What would be the reason for Africans in North America to support Washington's effort to seize Native American land and drive them all into poverty so this land could be stocked further with African slaves? Indeed, what would be the reason for Native Americans or Africans to back the Yankees during the 1776 revolution, when it was clear that the rebels were bent on further land seizures and enslavement? In fact, just as it can be questioned whether the Cold War victory was a triumph for Africans and African Americans, it is not far-fetched to suggest that the interests of the darker peoples in North America may have been better served had London been able to defeat the rebels. If, as Edmund Morgan has reminded us, American freedom is grounded in African slavery, then this conclusion is not at all far-fetched. It is mandated. So this argument that you have expanded in subsequent books, namely in the Counter-Revolution of 1776, which you all should also read, why is it so important, in your opinion, to resist the dominant historiography and set the historical record straight on the role Africans played during the Counter-Revolution that led to the formation of the United States of America?
Well, that's a huge question, and I hope that I don't spend too much time addressing it and therefore circumscribe the ability to ask further questions. But let me begin by saying that if you accept that 1776, the counter-revolution, was a great leap forward for humanity, then you have to accept a certain kind of self-abnegation if you're an African. That is to say, you have to say that it was a great leap forward for our ancestors to be further plunged into slavery. Because in 1776, there were thousands of Africans in the newly minted United States of America. By 1860, there were millions. And so if we're to accept that the 1776 was a great leap forward for humanity, we're also saying that it was a great leap forward for our ancestors to be enslaved. And in fact, if you scratch some of those who I call left-wing white nationalists, they are locked into this position that the enslavement of Africans helped to propel the productive forces of the United States of America. That is to say, it helped to develop the economy and generate more wealth. They don't take the next step to say that that's why we think that even the enslavement of Africans was a great leap forward for humanity. But that's the implicit message. And if you accept that implicit message, you're accepting self-hatred. You're accepting the status quo of mass incarceration and police terror and skyrocketing infant mortality rates with regard to black people who are just being born, for example. And so, in other words, to accept the mythology of the United States of America basically means that you accept self-hatred. And I think that that's an untenable position. At least I hope it's an untenable position. But given the fact that so many of our community have been forced to adopt that absurdist position, suggests that self-hatred and self-abnegation is part of the price of the ticket of being a Black U.S. patriot.
Yes, I definitely hear, and like you said, I think that there's throughout the history of being within the United States and throughout the miseducation and all the false information, and Black people haven't taken up this idea of being an American, and so therefore taking up the idea that yes, that 1776, you know, the winning of the revolution by those who were in the colonies was a great leap forward for Black people, like you said, but that means that you're accepting self-hatred. But I think that also explains why you have some people who say, well, you know, I'm glad slavery happened because otherwise I wouldn't be here. And we know that that is a white supremacist talking point when people say those things, right? They tell you should be grateful that you were enslaved because otherwise you'd be back there in Africa and, you know, that barbarous, uncivilized territory. They say the same thing to those on the African continent and say, like, you should be grateful for colonialism. Otherwise, you'd be stuck in a backward, you know, way of living. So, yes, so I think when you say that, yeah, it's just those are the examples of people buying into that story and therefore buying into the self-hatred and the false ideas of white supremacy and how they have saved you from something.
Well, you know, that's a further point too, which is reflective of the point that I mentioned in the introduction, which is to say that with regard to the so-called scientists of society in this country, they're akin to biology teachers who refuse to teach about DNA because that was only uncovered in the 1950s and their learning stops in the late 1940s. What I mean by that is years ago, the Martinican intellectual Aimé Césaire, followed by his comrade Frantz Fanon, had mentioned that what unfolded in Europe from the 1930s up to about 1945, that's commonly referred to as the Holocaust, the massive violations of human rights perpetrated by the Nazis, they had suggested that the ability to overlook and to sweep under the rug a similar Holocaust that had been inflicted upon the indigenous people of North America, the mass enslavement of Africans, that was a conditioned precedent for what unfolded in Europe. And so what's interesting is that you rarely hear many of our friends on the left talk about how when the Nazis came to power, that advanced the productive forces of Germany, for example. It led to the Autobahn, these mass interstate highways or mass high-speed highways. It led to the development of Volkswagen, which until recently has been a major auto manufacturer. But rather blithely, as I suggested in my comment a moment ago, they try to imply or get you to infer that the mass enslavement of Africans advanced the productive forces, and so therefore we should see that as a step forward. But they don't apply that to Europe, for example. And then if we say that that's racist, then they get upset, accuse you of playing the race card from the bottom of the deck, for example. So, I mean, it's little wonder why the capitalist world is in such grave difficulty right now with the tangerine tyrant coming back to power as of January 2025, with the stock market headed downward, with contradictions between and amongst various so-called allies, including Canada and Germany, headed for crisis, because the analysis is so misbegotten and so weak.
Yes, I agree. I think it's the double standard that we have to deal with as Black people. And also in the previously mentioned piece, Who Lost the Cold War, Africans and African Americans, you also refute some of the arguments, including the ones used by people on the left to discredit the alliance of many African nations and anti-imperialist or revolutionary African American leaders with the Eastern Bloc led by the USSR against the imperialist bloc led by the US. And you wrote, and I quote, presumably Stalinism was sufficient reason for African Americans to join Washington's Cold War, while looking the other way as stalwarts like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson were persecuted for their refusal to participate. Fine, but if Stalinism discredited socialism, why did slavery, the slave trade, and racism not discredit capitalism? If Soviet intervention in Eastern Europe discredited socialism, then why did the US backed of apartheid South Africa not discredit capitalism? End of quote. It seems that many of our friends and comrades on the Western left, including those who identify themselves as anti-imperialists, have not deviated from this tendency. So to give a recent example, our comrade Lucas Corner and Ricardo Vaz of the Venezuela Analysis have recently written a piece on left critiques that echo imperialist regime change propaganda against Venezuela, which they refer to as whitewashing imperialism. So my question is, how can the ideological and political descendant of Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and revolutionary Pan-Africans in general avoid falling into the trap of whitewashing imperialism?
Well, I would like to say, and I would like to think, that many of us have avoided that trap that you just sketched. The problem in the North Atlantic camp is that we're a distinct minority. And so even if we are able to put forward a progressive and historically sustainable line, that does not necessarily mean that it will carry the day, unless and until we are able to connect our progressive and historically sustainable line to a mass movement globally. And I would like to think that that is taking place as we speak, because quite frankly, with the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, I have not heard from Black people in particular that many critiques of the BRICS. I've heard quite a number of critiques from our quote so-called friends on the left, because they feel it doesn't go far enough. Although, of course, many of these same people, they didn't support the Comintern, the Communist International, headquartered in Moscow. So they always come up with an excuse for not backing these challenges to imperialism. Like with the BRICS, they say it doesn't go far enough, that it's not radical enough. And so therefore we're stuck with the status quo. Surprise, surprise. And so I think that I would like to think that things are proceeding in a positive direction, albeit understandably not rapidly enough for many of us. What I mean by that is that you see this crisis already enunciated by myself with regard to world imperialism. You see a crisis that reminds me of the mid-19th century. What I mean by that is the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, ignited a general crisis of the system of slavery that could only be resolved with its collapse. And so after 1804, for many, the progress was not seemingly moving rapidly enough. But by 1865, slavery was abolished in North America, and by 1888, abolished in Brazil, and basically had headed to the dustbin of history. With the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917, you saw similarly ignited a general crisis of capitalism and imperialism. And then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and many felt, as the neoconservative scholar at Stanford, Francis Fukuyama, stated, that we had reached the end of history. Capitalism had won, end of story. And I'm afraid to say that there were those on the left who subscribed to that wrong-headed notion. But what they failed to realize that in order to gain that exalted position of being the so-called sole remaining superpower, the United States had to cut a deal with the People's Republic of China. And now the People's Republic of China is a juggernaut that is plunging the capitalist auto industry into crisis, which has been the locomotive of capitalism generally for the last century. I'm speaking of the merger talks between Honda, Nissan, and Mitsubishi. I'm speaking of the aforementioned crisis of Volkswagen in Germany. I'm speaking of the fact that GM in the United States of America not only has lost billions in China, but is being challenged by the impending tariffs that are to be imposed by the Trump team on Canada and Mexico, which will compromise Michigan auto production given the integration of U.S. auto manufacturing with Canadian and Mexican auto manufacturing. And so this is due in no small measure to the fact that BYD of China is marketing a $7,000 electric vehicle, which the United States is trying to keep out of the market. This raises serious questions for Tesla, started by first buddy Elon Musk, refugee from apartheid South Africa, which is doing great business in China as we speak, but obviously that is destined to be reduced given the rise of BYD. And so what I just said about the auto industry is a microcosm of this general crisis of capitalism and imperialism generally. Because other than buying a home for many working class and middle class folk in the advanced capitalist countries, the major purchase and the major investment is in an automobile, for example. And so this obviously spells ill for the major capitalist countries, and it obviously creates an opening for revolutionary forces in the North Atlantic camp. And I remain confident that we will be able to take advantage of these openings that have been created.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I think, recognizing when we have opportunities and openings is something really important that we need to always keep an eye on. And so I wanted to also, in that, thinking about that, turn a little bit to something that you referred to as the Richard Pryor School of History. And this last quote from the piece, who lost the Cold War, Africans and African Americans, you wrote, and I'll just bring the quote up here. The comedian Richard Pryor once joked that Blacks should keep quiet about their association with the Buffalo Soldiers, those U.S. Army men who were so essential in routing and displacing Native Americans in the far West. You quote quote, "You want them to hate us too," he remarked. African Americans should claim no credit for a Cold War triumph that the 21st century will reveal was costly indeed. In retrospect, Du Bois was right. Sampson and the NAACP leadership were wrong in endorsing the Cold War. And let me just move it along for everyone. And endorsing the Cold War agenda, if the principal criterion for judging is what has been in the best interest of Africans and African Americans. More to the point, we do not need to create what could well be called a Richard Pryor school of history that causes us to celebrate what should be mourned. So it seems that U.S. imperialism is determined to continue relying on quote unquote Buffalo soldiers in civil or military positions to do their dirty work. So to give just a few examples, there are many African Americans who hold key positions in the current Biden administration. So these include U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, Joint Chief of Staff Charles Q. Brown, Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas Greenfield, and all of these have played a shameful and devastating role in supporting the U.S.-funded genocide against the Palestinians, as well as the destabilization of African countries. African Americans are also disproportionately represented in the U.S. Army, and not just in the Army. We know that even when we think about the ROTC and their way of recruiting and within high schools around the U.S., where they are placed, is also disproportionate when we think about schools that are mostly African or largely African American. And so I'm wondering if you could, just talk a little bit about, also I wanted to mention the fact that Michael Langley, the head of AFRICOM, U.S. Command in Africa, is also an African American. So I wanted to know, are we ignoring Richard Pryor's advice for us to, not go along with these, doing the dirty work of, Europeans who are a detriment?
Well, the point you raise is profound, and it's profound in many ways, not least because it points to the difficult dilemma that we as Black people face under U.S. capitalism and imperialism. What I mean by that is, you may recall that in 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, overturned affirmative action programs designed to allow Black youth to be admitted into various schools, various universities, various professions, for example, the law, etc. But they carved out an exception for the military academies. That is to say, you could continue to recruit heavily for Black people to be admitted to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado, West Point, just north of New York City. And it appears that that decision will hold. And that speaks to a number of points. It speaks to the point that you just articulated, which is that U.S. imperialism is heavily dependent upon the abilities of people like C.Q. Brown, the top military man, for example, or Lloyd Austin, the top civilian in the U.S. military and a former military man himself, and of course, a former board member of Raytheon, a major contractor for the military-industrial complex. But at the same time, Pete Hegseth, designated by Mr. Trump as the incoming leader of the U.S. Pentagon, has gone on record as saying that he wants to see a purge of these Black people at the highest levels, starting with C.Q. Brown, for example. So the lesson that I think we should infer from this particular conundrum, on the one hand, one wing of U.S. imperialism is saying that we should continue to be recruited to serve the interests of U.S. imperialism. Another wing of the ruling class says that no, we should be purged. And if you face a no-win proposition, which is what that basically is, either you're going to be cannon fodder or you're going to be purged, which then will allow white supremacists to occupy the highest levels of the U.S. military, which then will facilitate the rise and surge of neo-Nazism. That's a classic no-win proposition, which should tell you that the status quo is no longer sustainable and that we need to break from the status quo altogether. We need to revisit the Compromise of 1954, where in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, such as C.Q. Brown being head of the U.S. military, Black internationalists like Paul Robeson would be tossed overboard. The price of the ticket, of course, was that Black Americans were forced to distance themselves from internationalism. And so, therefore, today, in 2024, 2025, it's difficult to find any Black American assessments of the rise of China, for example, perhaps the most important development of the last half millennium. Although there's a lot of rhetoric about what's happening in Africa, you don't really see fine-grained analyses. By and large, of course, there are exceptions with regard to these tumultuous events in the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, for example. You don't see an analysis, for example, of this new role for Nigeria that France is trying to carve out, whereby it will court Abuja as a compensation for being booted out of the Sahel, being booted out of Chad, being booted out of Senegal, for example. And so what that means is that Black Americans in particular find themselves almost without allies on the international scene, precisely because of this Compromise of 1954, as we are staring down the barrel of what many sober analysts perceive to be a new wave of fascism. And of course, the rise of vigilantism, that is to say, self-described vigilantes are killing Black people willy-nilly, such as the Marine who killed Jordan Neely on the New York subway, and then was acquitted, and in fact was embraced by President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, inviting him to celebrate with them at the last week's Army-Navy football game. Cal Rittenhouse, who took his rifle and began shooting anti-police terror activists in Kenosha, Wisconsin, now is a hero of the right wing. And so we're facing this very seriously profound crisis as Black people, yet without the kind of global support and global alliances that helped to propel the end of slavery, that helped to propel the retreat of Jim Crow. And so obviously, to escape the dilemma that you just articulated, we need to rethink the Compromise of 1954. In fact, we need to repudiate the Compromise of 1954.
Absolutely. No, I 100% agree. And I think I don't know who it was I was talking to, or, where I was saying it, but I think when you were talking about how this is the place that we're in now, where you said, within the United States, African Americans don't have much allies because we've been cut off from internationalism, and Black internationalists have been thrown overboard. And I think at the same time that Black internationalists have been thrown overboard, Pan-Africanism has been thrown overboard with Black internationalism, because I feel like those are things that people are not readily talked about, but also those are things that are not readily accepted in terms of the way in which we're told to think about our situation within the United States. We're no longer told to think of it from a nationalist point of view, an internationalist point of view, or from a Pan-Africanist point of view, to just think of it, more in a more minute way. Go ahead, Dr. Horne.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a friendly amendment to what I just said. I'm speaking as if our audience is exclusively Black Americans, and I should also speak to our friends who are on the screen with us, who are in Europe, who obviously are justifiably concerned about the rise of Marine Le Pen in France, for example, which does not bode well, to put it euphemistically. The impending elections in the Federal Republic of Germany, where Elon Musk, the aforementioned South African billionaire, has just thrown his support behind the so-called AfD, the neo-Nazi party in Germany, which does not bode well. Do not be surprised if they enter the government. We have been distressed by these reports from Austria, for example, with regard to the rising influence of neo-Nazi forces. I should also mention in this context, with regard to the Anglosphere, that Elon Musk has also thrown his support behind Nigel Farage, the head of the so-called Reform Party of the UK, which is, I would say, a friendly ally of neo-fascist forces in Great Britain. And so it's not just Black Americans in North America who should be concerned by these global trends. I think the Black people in Europe, such as the people with whom we're sharing this screen, are justifiably and understandably concerned as well, and obviously should draw the appropriate lessons from the history of Black Americans.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Horne. Since you were talking about the compromise of 1954, which, by the way, is a topic that you have mentioned in several of the articles that are in this book, I dare say, including a book that is dealing with how U.S. lawyers have reacted to anti-apartheid, have been involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. So the article is titled "Hands Across the Water: Afro-American Lawyers and the Decolonization of Southern Africa." So in that article, you write, and I'll quote you here, especially after World War II, it seemed that civil rights groups had made something of a Faustian, quote, Faustian, unquote, bargain with the rulers of the U.S. in return for muteness or support of U.S. foreign policy. There would be civil rights concession at home. With the coming to independence of African nations, Jim Crow at home was becoming an etching hill in winning hearts and minds abroad. So these concessions had to come in any case. Nevertheless, the NAACP not only backed the U.S. war against Vietnam, but attacked others who refused to agree. The same held true earlier for the war in Korea. So since this show is titled Amandla, and we've also been discussing your own involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle, and also your book, White Supremacy Confronted, which talks about how U.S. imperialism was involved in supporting the racist and white supremacy regime of apartheid in South Africa. I was wondering if you can tell us more about how the compromise of 1954 actually impacted the engagement of African Americans in the anti-apartheid struggle.
Well, it had a profound effect. Although you would get the idea in 2024, 2025, that the Black community was united behind Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress during the bad old days of apartheid. That's not altogether accurate, as I detail at some length in my book, White Supremacy Confronted, because Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress were and still are in alliance with the South African Communist Party. Now, of course, we're paying attention to the fact that the SACP has just announced it'll be running candidates against the ANC in 2026 local elections. But I'm talking about the period leading up to 1994. And because of this alliance with the SACP, the mainstream civil rights organizations and a lot of Black liberal forces did not feel that they could associate with the ANC, particularly since we now know, as reported in my book, that Mandela himself had been part of the leadership at one time of the South African Communist Party. And so Black Americans found themselves in this anomalous position of supposedly being opposed to apartheid, but at the same time trying to keep distance from the forces that are battling apartheid. And obviously this was an untenable position, and it continues to this very day. What I mean by that is that Congressman Gregory Meeks, a leading member of the Congressional Black Caucus from Southeast Queens, New York, the ranking Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has been carrying legislation that would seek to sanction and penalize today South Africa because of its foreign policy positions, because of its dragging U.S. ally Israel into the dock in the International Court of Justice, making out a plausible case for genocide, against Palestinians because of South Africa's premier and vanguard role in BRICS, aforementioned Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, presenting a stiff challenge to the hegemony of the North Atlantic imperialist camp. And it's not just Gregory Meeks. And explaining this also helps to expand upon why we are faced with such a dilemma. When you get forces like Congressman Jamal Bowman, recently ousted from Congress, representing a district just north of New York City, he's ousted from Congress because of his stern and staunch opposition to Zionist depredations in Gaza. And the Zionist lobby spent millions of dollars to defeat him. And so this is part of the problem that we face. The Compromise of 1954 is still in effect, but now we've come to see that it's not simply a matter, although it is a matter, of Black leaders being lapdogs for imperialism. It's also a matter of those who seek to break with that retrograde consensus, such as Congressman Bowman of Bronx, Westchester, New York, being deluged with funds that drive him out of office, for example. So this is nothing new in terms of sketching a dilemma, a crisis faced by Black Americans. The way we've dealt with these dilemmas and crises in the past, of course, is lengthening the battlefield. That is to say, reaching out to our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, reaching out to our brothers and sisters on the African continent, being a steady and reliable presence at gatherings of CARICOM, the Caribbean community, for example, a steady and reliable presence at the African Union summits that take place in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia on a regular basis, reaching out to our brothers and sisters in Western Europe, for example, in London and France and the Federal Republic of Germany, for example. But the tragedy of today's politics, at least amongst Black Americans, is that not only is there a dearth and a lack of such outreach, many of our leaders and many of their followers don't even realize that this is what we desperately need, and therein lies our tragedy.
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. Go ahead, Malika. I think you want.
Right. I totally agree, but I want to take it back a little bit and go back to the different U.S. allies, notably in the 90s, important allies of the U.S. ruling class, mainly the Lumpens. So in 1997, you wrote an essay titled Rethink the Lumpen, Gangsters and the Political Economy of Capitalism, in which you argue, and I quote, organized crime, the big Lumpen, historically has been of the bourgeoisie's chief allies in this nation in maintaining its hegemony. In return, gangsters have been allowed in some instances to evolve respectably to bourgeois status themselves. In any case, mobsters in these nations have employed a form of enrichment that the bourgeoisie in many nations will never see. This has added level of coarseness and lack of principle to the otherwise crude and unprincipled rule of the bourgeoisie. So when we interviewed you in August, I believe, on your book, Armed Struggles, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s, you argued that amongst the mistakes that the Panthers made was their excessive reliance on the Lumpen. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and also explain why the Lumpens should not be conflated with the working class.
Well, thank you for that question. And once again, I'll only be able to give a 2 or 3 minute response this morning, but I elaborate on that point at some length in the essay, and I dare say, which I will point your audience to, not to mention this 700-page book on Southern California. But in any case, with regard to the Black Panther Party arising in the mid-1960s in North America, I think that their reliance upon the Lumpen, which is also defined in the essay and also in the book, that this was a response to the ideological weaknesses of the working class in the United States. That is to say that historically, there has been this idea that the working class would be the locomotive, would be the engine to overthrow bourgeois rule. But under settler colonialism, there's been a kind of class collaboration amongst the working class. You see this in the United States in the recent election, where the head of the Teamsters Union, now on strike, interestingly enough, against Amazon, spoke at the Republican Party convention. You see it with regard to East Coast Longshore, the International Longshore Association, where the leader is a Trump supporter. And of course, they have also been threatening strikes. And of course, the leader has a hefty six-figure salary, a palatial mansion in New Jersey, a Bentley in his driveway. And if you don't know what a Bentley is, consult your local rapper. But in any case, that particular union, and indeed the Teamsters themselves, they were propelled into power with regard to a kind of alliance between working class forces and lumpen forces. In fact, this is so notorious, it's been represented in cinema, which of course is drawn from reality. If you look at the history of James Hoffa, the leader of the Teamsters in the 1950s and the 1960s, and let me say that I come from a Teamster family, and I have a personal stake in this because my father was a truck driver, and his pension was frittered away by Teamsters investments in league with organized crime in Las Vegas casinos, which helped to generate tremendous wealth for leaders of that particular union, not to mention their comrades in organized crime. But ultimately, this caught up with James Hoffa, and he disappeared. It's still unclear what happened to him, although it's safe to say that he is no longer in the land of the living. And so I cite these episodes to suggest that when I was writing that article, Rethinking the Lumpen, in the I Dare Say piece, this was in the midst of quite a bit of press coverage of what was called gangster rap, for example. And I was in the midst of publishing a book on the film industry. And what's little known about Hollywood is that it was propelled into international prominence, not least because of an alliance with organized crime. That's why you have this entire genre of gangster movies, for example, that tend to laud organized crime, some of which are rather interesting. For example, Godfather 2, for example, or State of Grace, which deals with the Irish mob in New York City, starring Sean Penn. And so I think that what happened is that many Black people, seeing the debilities of working class struggle given class collaboration, thought that a sure path, a sure route was the lumpen route. Certainly it would be a sure path to wealth, as represented by some of our friends in the entertainment industry who happen to be Black, who have at least helped to perpetuate lumpen tendencies, be it brutalizing of women, be it various kinds of scams and frauds, et cetera. I won't mention any names because some of these forces are in enough hot water as it is, as we speak, without my piling on. But in any case, once, as with the compromise of 1954, I think it's time to rethink this fascination with the lumpen and to realize that, as suggested by the difficulties now being endured by some young Black men, the recent trial in Atlanta, for example, of Young Thug, I'll mention his name, and the trials now unfolding in New York City of other figures whose names I will not mention, that because of racism and white supremacy, it's going to be very difficult for Black lumpen to imitate Jewish American lumpen, who then used the illicit funds from bootleg liquor in the 1920s to then migrate into legitimate liquor, and now, of course, use that fund, that kind of capital, to then invest in DuPont Chemical, for example, to invest in entertainment industry I'm speaking, I'll mention the Bronfman family if you want to do a Google search, Bronfman. And there are many examples of those defined as white, particularly those who entered late into the hallowed halls of whiteness, such as Jewish Americans and Italian Americans, being able to climb the class ladder to untold wealth and affluence by means of lumpen tactics, if not lumpen identity, and then becoming respectable in subsequent generations, such as the Bronfman family. It's going to be very difficult because of white supremacy for young black men to take that path, to think that they can do the same thing. I think that for a while that might be possible, but as our friend who has now been in detention for 4 or 5 months in Brooklyn, whose name I will not mention once again, his case tends to exemplify that it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, for these young black men to imitate Jewish American and Italian American men of previous generations in using the lumpen as a vehicle for class advance.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. Also, just wanted to mention to our audience another book in which you deal with the issue of the lumpen and organized crime, which is the Bittersweet Science, Race Manufacturing and the Political Economy of Boxing. Actually, there's a very interesting episode, which I really recommend to our audience, with our comrade Anthony Ballas on the De Facto podcast, in which you talk about this book. You also mentioned several of the elements that you have just given your response, the role of Irish migrants and etc. So talking about the weaknesses of the working class in the US and how our so-called friends on the so-called left have reacted to it, I wanted to ask you a last question about what you call left-wing white nationalism. So once again, it's the last article in this piece, I dare say, sorry. It's called White Republic. It was published in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, and you're actually responding to people we can call, without naming them, obviously, left-wing white nationalists, right? So in that piece, you write, and I'm going to quote you here, when settlers arrived in what is now North Carolina in the 1580s, it was a multi-class venture, shopkeepers, myth, etc., sponsored by the London elite. This was in the midst of religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. All of a sudden, when crossing the Atlantic in a manner that would make Madison Avenue blush, all are rebranded as, quote, white, unquote, which subsumes many of the tension, ethnic and class among them in new monetized and militarized, quote, identity politics, unquote, of, quote, whiteness, unquote, based on expropriation of the indigenous and mass enslavement of the Africans. And then you conclude by saying that the attempt to build class unity without confronting these underlying tensions often has meant coercing oppressed nationalities, blacks in the first place, to co-sign a kind of, quote, left-wing white nationalism, unquote, as reflected in the lengthy attempt to convert slaveholder Thomas Jefferson into a unifying symbol. Black failure to do so leads to our denunciation in today's terms as, quote, identitarian, unquote, in previous decades as, quote, narrow nationalist, unquote. Actually, the class collaboration embodied in whiteness, quote, unquote, was seeking to impose class collaboration on the descendants of the enslaved, including us to align with enslavers and their descendants, end of quote. So my last question, and this is something that, you know, we could have dedicated the whole session to that. And actually, there's a show on the Black Power Media Rise of Morning show in which we talked about left-wing white nationalism. So the last question I would like to ask you for this first episode of Amandla is, our class collaboration and left-wing white nationalism the biggest assets of US colonialism internally and abroad?
Well, I'm not sure if it's the biggest asset, but it's a major asset. It is a profound asset. It is a huge asset. That's point number one. Point number two is that I think what we have just exemplified in this exchange, if I must say so myself, is the value of writing, because what I wrote that you just put on the screen and you just read out aloud, I'm not sure if I can replicate in my off-the-cuff remarks the insight, if I may be permitted to say so, as represented in those words. And so therefore, I would urge and suggest those who are interested in following up on this discourse to go back to the written word and examine the written word. And of course, listen to the spoken word, perhaps as you're washing dishes or vacuuming the carpets, for example. But I will say this, that it is curious, is it not, that many Euro-Americans across class lines, one of their favorite descriptors for Black people of a certain ideological stripe is that we're enmeshed in identity politics, for example. When, as I said, the original identity politics was this artificial identity of whiteness, for example, which is then normalized, or as certain critics like to say, made invisible, to the point where those enmeshed in it don't even realize it. It's quite telling, is it not, that those who toss around this term identity politics, I don't think I've ever heard one of them affix that descriptor to the Zionist entity known as Israel, which is a state based upon an exclusivist ethno-religious identity. If Israel is not an identity politics state, well, obviously the concept has no meaning. It's an empty, vacuous concept. And it's quite telling. And also sort of an example of bullying, that identity politics is applied to people like myself or yourselves, but not applied to Israel. Because if they applied it to Israel, they might lose their jobs. They might, even be denaturalized. And pay attention to that new verb, denaturalized, because Mr. Trump is going to be trying to strip the citizenship away from many of us beginning in January 2025. And so I'm afraid to say that by the end of 2025, about a year from now, if you'll do a Google search, you'll see denaturalized becoming a common term in 2025, not so much in 2024. And this reference to Thomas Jefferson, for example, whose stock has been plummeting of late, the so-called founding father, the so-called author of the Declaration of Independence. As I talk about in my book on Southern California, for the longest period, there were many of our friends on the left who were trying to convert Thomas Jefferson into sort of a unifying figure. That's the man we were supposed to identify with. Set aside for the moment the fact that he was a slave owner, set aside for the moment the fact that he was likely a child molester, given the fact that his paramour, quote unquote, Sally Hemings, was a teenager and he was a man well into adulthood when they began their intimate relationship. This was the man that the left said we should identify with. And examining that and taking that diamond and holding it up to the light and examining it from various angles helps us to understand why it is that the left has had so much difficulty gaining traction in this country. Because what they've sought to do is take a certain kind of left-wing white nationalism and get all of the rest of us to sign on to it, to co-sign it. And then when we don't co-sign it, we're denounced. So what kind of political strategy is that? It's a political strategy that leads to the rise of neo-fascism. That's the kind of political strategy that is designed to attain and accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add that I think, it's also a political strategy that helps to maintain white supremacy. Like you're talking about, that these people, they want us to take up these left-wing white nationalists, they want us to take up these ideas so that we can help to do all the things that we've been talking about throughout the show, right? To be and to take up, this idea of being and doing the dirty work of America, because we've signed on to these false notions of what they're presenting us, and we've signed on to their history of white supremacy and saying, oh yes, that history of white supremacy and those goals of white supremacy and those aims of white supremacy in America and internationally are the same as us, are the same for those of us who are Africans in America, Africans across the world. So I like to thank you, Dr. Horne, for being here with us today. I want to remind the people really quickly about the books that we mentioned today. So Dare I Say by Dr. Gerald Horne, as well as we also mentioned the other two books that I thought I had on the screen, but clearly they're not here. But Bouna mentioned them before as well. African Americans and the new, let me get the name really quickly.
African Americans, the New History of the U.S.
The New History of the U.S., as well as Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists, and Liberals in South California through the 60s and the 70s. And as I said before, thank you to my comrades, Bouna, Malika, and thank you again, Dr. Gerald Horne, for being here. This is our first show, but this is not our last show. This is our first of many shows here on Black Power Media Reloaded. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and also hit the notification buttons so that you can know when our next Amandla show will be happening. So everyone have a great day, and thank you again, Dr. Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely.
We do not see the creation of the United States in the 18th century as a great leap forward for humanity. We see the creation of the United States of America as a great leap forward for enslavement of Africans, as a great leap forward in terms of European settlers seizing the land of the indigenous and then liquidating them. I'm afraid to say that many of our so-called friends on the left have either ignored our intervention, which is like biology teachers deciding that they don't like the uncovering of DNA in the early 1950s, and so therefore they're not going to teach that in their biology classes. And so this is scandalous. These books that I've been writing about slavery also invoke the notion of revolution. That is to say, my book confronting Black Jacobins, the United States Haitian Revolution, the origins of the Dominican Republic, confronts the epical, profound Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, a successful revolt of the enslaved. Many of us in the Black liberation movement in the United States pay careful and close attention to the international situation. And we use that in order to plot strategy. That helps to determine whether or not we should advance or should we retreat. And right now, I would say it's time for advance. I often say about the United States, if you want to keep it secret, publish it in a book, because people don't read. But I'm also beginning to think they don't necessarily listen either. So obviously there's something deeper. There's some sort of ideological blind spot that hampers the absorption of reality.